So first of all, can everybody hear me okay? All right, excellent. So my name is Antoine Dubeauclard. You can't hear me. Am I speak up? Okay, all right. Oh, you gotcha. Okay, I wasn't sure it was me. So my name is Antoine Dubeauclard, and I do a few things in life. I have a web company that's called Media Genesis. It's right off 15 and Maple and Coolidge, if you're familiar with that area, Stevenson area. And we do a lot of website development. We do a lot of branding and marketing, some videos. I've worked on some reality shows. We've done animations and all kinds of other fun stuff. So I've worked with some large organizations like the United Nations. I've worked with things like the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. We've helped launch cars such as Chevrolet vehicles and Chryslers and all that fun stuff. And that's just one part of my life. I also work with two organizations. Oh, we got a jumper. Two organizations, one of which is connected to the arts, which is a thing I really care about. One of the things I discovered in life is that it's important to, your work, down the road will become an important part of your life, but sometimes you have things that you're passionate about that you can't necessarily get through your work. And it's important to kind of nurture and develop those things. And I'm lucky now at the stage in my life where I can have more time to experience that and get involved with it. And I do a lot of that through nonprofit stuff. So I volunteer for, you're probably familiar with Cranbrook. So I do a lot of work with Cranbrook, and I help specifically with their art academy and museum. And we just got a big donation recently of $30 million to really increase both the arts and allow more people to get scholarships to go and do a graduate program in the arts. And then the other thing I do is I work in what's called citizen diplomacy. And I work with a program that's funded by the US State Department. So I've got 3 citizenships. I was born in Canada from French parents, and I became a US citizen at the age of 18. So actually English is my 3rd language. And it was not easy. I learned English in the beginning outside New York City, when New York City was pretty tough. I got dropped into schools with no knowledge of what was going on, and it took me a few months to even understand a single word. So that was interesting. We can talk about that in a little bit. And as part of that, I've always had an interest in international affairs. And I think it's incredible how when you get exposed to other countries and other cultures, and you step aside from what you see in social media or what you see in the media about countries, and you really get to go there or speak to actual people who are from those areas, inevitably you discover things that you didn't realize, and things that you took for granted or that you heard in media you realize are completely off. So through that program, what we do is we work with US embassies around the world, and they identify people of interest to the United States, so emerging world leaders. And for the last 50 years, this organization has identified many people that down the road became heads of state. So they became presidents of countries or prime ministers, including England, France, India, and a few others. So they've had a very good run of identifying these really incredible people. And so we had 700 people that came from around the world to the Detroit area last year from 138 countries. And as part of that program, I recently went to Dubai to see the World Expo, which was super interesting, and really interesting to see United Arab Emirates, which is a very new country that's about 30 years old, that literally is built out of the sand. So that's a country where they really believe that and act upon the fact that the only limitation is their imagination. So they're literally building something, and it's funny, like they kept on talking about this creek, in Dubai. And you've got the largest building in the world, the Burj Khalifa, and the tallest, the highest, and they've got this amazing set of waterways all around the city. And they kept on talking about this creek, and I said, why do you keep on talking about this thing that you call a creek? And they said, well, that's what it was. It was a 1-foot deep creek that they've made into a harbor where boats can come in, and it's now literally square miles of they built it like a pool. So the whole thing is connected to the Indian Ocean, very far away, but it's all canals and waterways that are finished just like you would a pool. So that blue stuff that you would see in a pool, they have that over a large part of the city. So it's completely incredible. So my point is, I came back from there, and it just reminded me how, anything can really happen in the world, and it's more a question of having the willingness and the imagination, and sometimes it takes some exposure to something that's foreign or different to realize how we can do things totally differently. So that's kind of what I want to start off with. I do have a couple of things I can talk to you about. One of them that's just close to my world is the French elections just happened a few days ago, so I want to kind of share how that works, because you'll see how that's vastly different than the way it's done in this country. And it might open your eyes to the notion that maybe it could be done differently here too. So that's one thing I can talk to you about. I can talk to you more about experiences in Dubai. It was really incredible to see the World Expo, and I can talk about what that's about because many people don't necessarily know anymore what that is. And then I can talk to you about my experience if you want as an immigrant coming here and what that was like both in New York and Michigan. So any questions before I get things started? Anything you're curious to hear more about versus one versus the other? Questions, comments? Let me ask you this question. How many of you are familiar with the World Expo? Maybe I can start with that. You familiar with that? How many of you are familiar with the Eiffel Tower? Familiar with that? So the Eiffel Tower was actually one of the showpieces in the World Expo. So in France, when they built the Eiffel Tower, as part of a broad World Expo where a bunch of countries showed the best things that their country had to offer. So imagine like at the time maybe 100 countries showing the best things they had, and it was hosted in Paris, and they built the Eiffel Tower as part of that. And what they do for these expos is insane. Over the course of 6 months, they build up this huge village with all these pavilions, one for each country, and then 6 months later, they tear them all down. And it's just incredible to watch. Now, keep in mind, in that 6-month period, in Dubai, the World Expo, they had 25 million people that showed up and visited it. So imagine the state of Michigan is about 10 million people. It's like 2.5 times the whole population of Michigan in 6 months showed up to watch this thing. Now, what's really shocking about it is that the US, at the end of the Cold War, so when essentially the Soviet Empire kind of crumbled in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the US said, we don't really need to do this type of stuff, which was more they saw as international diplomacy, because there's no real threat. We're not under threat from the Soviet Empire, so we're going to no longer belong to this. So it's kind of like if we decided to stop doing the Olympics. We said, you know what, we'll just skip it. We don't need to do it. So the US is one of the only countries that basically, out of 150 plus countries, that said we're not doing it. And for a number of years, didn't do anything at all. And then they said, okay, we're willing to get back into the organization, kind of like the Olympics as an organization, but we're not going to fund it. So it has to be privately funded. So keep in mind that every other country in the world, more or less, certainly all the major countries, like the United States, is all funding it through their government to showcase what the US is doing. And we're completely outside of it. So we're not doing it. So State Department said, we sent a group of about 30 kids from Detroit to Dubai, and we also helped set up all the cultural entertainment for the US Pavilion. So all the musical acts and things of that nature. So we actually, they said, if you'd like to come because you've helped us do this, we'd welcome you to go and visit. So we got on a plane and flew to Dubai, which is about a 24-hour journey by the time you start to end. So it's long and it's far. But when we got there, we got to see the World Expo, and we had they gave us passes that were diplomatic passes. So we got to visit some of the pavilions with heads of state. So we actually did it with the South African president, for example. But what's really cool about it is that each one of the pavilions, you can look at it online, are these incredible marvels of technology and advancements, and they're from all around the world. So I'll give you one example. You had the UK pavilion, was a very large structure with all these words on it that kept on changing, so very, very large. And when you walk up the thing, you would get to the inside of it that felt like the inside of a large nest. So you would see the outside of it facing outward. When you got on the inside, you could use your phone, and you could submit a word, and that word would be, they would take that word and they would write a poem digitally. So it was like artificial intelligence would create a poem around the world, and then your word would show up on the screen. So it's kind of this interactive thing where it's constantly changing with the people submitting and reacting to what they were reading on the screen. That's just one example. So they had a lot of things like that that were super engaging and interactive.
I'm going to show it if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep, there it is. Perfect. So what you're seeing here is the outside, okay? And on the inside of it, so you walk through, these are staircases that take you in, you go on the inside, and the inside is the place where you get to interact with the words. So a whole bunch, imagine this whole classroom, all being able to use their phones, and all being able to put information, and then you're seeing all of that combine itself together. So of course you see one word, you see other words, you might decide to add new words to it based on what you're reading, so it's very interactive. So, I mean, I would call this one more of a single trick pony, like that was the single idea. Others had all kinds of other ideas, like they would talk about future cities and how cities could evolve. Others had these very soulful videos. One of the ones that was, I think, an outlier, because it was not considered one of the best booths, was a Spanish one, and they had this incredible video that was kind of showing how everybody's all connected, and it was all connected through music. And it was I can describe it, I don't know if the video's out there, but it's this whole theme where This guy is basically repairing this big kind of stage light. Imagine like one of the ones on a football field, and he hits it, and it's dark, and all of a sudden the whole sun illuminates as if it's daytime. It's like, what the heck happened? And then you see that scene being replayed throughout the country with various things, with various people happening, and then they realize that they are acting upon the weather and changing the actual environment around them. And it becomes kind of this, they're all participating in composing this piece of music. And it was really a beautiful piece, but there were a bunch of others like that. So my point is the World Expo is phenomenal, and it just brings you a lot of ideas. And if you ever have a chance to experience it, you should. And even going virtually, and you can see some of the pavilions and get to see what they're about. But if you ever have a chance to do it, it's a lot like the Olympics. It's just not very well known in the United States.
Did you say why the U.S. doesn't participate?
Primarily because the U.S. has pulled away from a lot of international diplomacy kind of activities, and there's a lot less funding and support for it, which is unfortunate. So there's still people that are very passionate about it within the State Department, but it's one of those things that just they have a difficult time getting funding for it. And you know, in the $60 million sounds like a lot of money, right, to any of us, but in the grand scheme of the budget that the U.S. government has, it's really not a very big number. I mean, you could make just a few missiles for that cost. You know what I'm saying? So there's lots better uses to showcase what the United States is like, and to expose that to, in this case, 25 million people who otherwise may never be able to set foot in this country, but want to know what it's about. So one thing, for example, I'll tell you that was very touching for me was I went to the Ukraine pavilion, and the Ukraine pavilion was very. It was difficult, and you could tell the staff, of course, this is in the middle of what's going on back home for them, which is a very difficult time. But what was staggering was they had this little program where you could put Post-it notes, and people literally started writing Post-it notes and put it all over the pavilion. So literally this pavilion, so imagine this classroom with every single inch that you can see and touch covered in plastic notes and paper Post-it notes of support. So literally I'm talking millions of Post-it notes. So you walk into it and you feel all this energy from all these people who are basically kind of sharing in what's happening over there. And it was really, really something that I didn't expect. That was incredibly touching. So that's an example of these kinds of things, right? So very, very cool experience in that respect. Yeah. Yeah. Any questions about the World Expo before I keep on going? Go ahead.
When was this?
So it just closed March 31st. So the World Expos are, I think there's a mini expo. The US is actually bidding on one in Minneapolis. I don't know if we'll get it. That's a smaller one, but it really happens every 7 years. So it's something that, again, because we don't, as a government, invest a lot in it, doesn't mean that the rest of the world doesn't. So if you ever have an opportunity to go see it, keep an eye out for it. It's one of those things that I think is kind of, it's very impactful, right? Go ahead.
Do you know why it happens every 7 years?
There's a cycle to it. A lot of these larger international events take a lot of energy to put together. Like what I can tell you about this particular expo is the size and scale of it was beyond what I imagined. That was true of everything in Dubai, actually. So meaning that the downtown area was much bigger than I expected. But in this case, you're literally talking about building a whole city is what you're talking about. You're talking about, I think it was 2 square miles maybe. And actually, I don't know if you can pull up the map of the expo, but I'm going to show you kind of the size of it so you can see how many pavilions were there. What I can tell you is I did about 30 pavilions, and that was with these fast passes where I could literally just walk right in when there were sometimes lines of an hour. What I can tell you is when I look at it, I did like less than a quarter of the overall thing. So part of it is the investment to build it takes a long time. And then it's a huge investment. I don't know if you have the...
I don't know if I have it.
Yeah, there's one that kind of shows you the whole thing. It might be hard to find. Something else, yeah. So what they're going to do is they're basically going to tear it down except for 3 or 4 pavilions. So the Saudi Arabian pavilion was incredible, this large piece of kind of steel and these words that would go on it as well in green. And then they're going to keep a few of those pavilions and they're going to basically turn the rest of it into a business incubator and housing for people because they're growing that fast. One thing I'll tell you that was fascinating to me, one of the things I always like to do is I always like to talk to cab drivers. So we met with an emir, we had some really incredible experiences going to a palace. This person has his own private museum with 15,000 items, incredibly luxurious, super interesting. But another dimension is to talk to people who are really doing the work, every single day, driving people and talking to people. And they're all from different countries. So about half the population is from India and Pakistan, and then some African countries. And inevitably, I asked them, how long have you been here? How do you like it? Tell me more. And they all love the country. And what's interesting is they come from different cultures, different religion. And one of the things that they do when they first come in, you get a visa, you have to go through an orientation. And the orientation says, they say to them, you have to leave whatever issues you have with other people, whatever issues you have with other cultures, all that you have to leave at the border. When you're here, this is run by the families, the emirs and emirates. They said, you have to treat every person who comes here like their family. And it's funny because the reason why I asked those questions is because everywhere I went, if you, for a single moment, you were kind of looking around, people would take you under their arms and say, where do you need to go? How can I help you? And so the whole culture is around helping other people. And it's incredible because you got people from every religion, every color, every denomination, every country. And the idea is it's culture of tolerance and it's culture of helping one another like family. So it's a very important thing to realize that, again, you may hear lots of different things, but until you go there, you start feeling that you're being treated differently than you may be at home. And that's a great value. Part of it is they're building a new society. So they said, if we're going to build a society, how do we want people to treat one another? And that's the rule. Now, the flip side of that coin is, I was kind of shocked because I arrive at a busy intersection, and there's times when there's no cars, and I'm looking and I'm like, I want to cross the street, but everybody's sitting there because it's the red light, and I'm like, so then when I'm in another country, I follow what the locals do because that's smart to do, but then I realized none of them cross the street when it's a red, when it's a red light, there's no traffic, and partly because, again, the idea is that you follow the rules, right? So nobody's like in the United States. I mean, how often do you see people walking when it's a red light, when there's no cars? All the time, right? People even do that sometimes in their own cars, which is even crazier. But point is, they're absolutely not. You can't do that because there's essentially very little tolerance for people to deviate from the rules because, again, they want to create a society where everybody follows those rules that are kind of common across so that everybody behaves well with one another.
I'm going to try this and see if this is what you were thinking.
Yes.
Any of this.
So probably like this right here kind of shows you, this is an aerial view, this is a great view of it. Yeah. So this right here, this kind of shows you the size and scale of it. When I talk about a city, I really do mean a ginormous city.
When I clicked on it.
Yeah. So this is what it looks like. So what you're seeing here are different wings here. There's different pavilions, like groups of pavilions. So each one of these buildings is a pavilion. Each one of those is like a building the size, not quite of this school, but like, say, a percentage of this school. So imagine, I don't know how many, total square footage it is, but it's absolutely enormous. Yeah, so I pretty much was able to only focus in one area. And this thing right over here, I think is the largest unsupported dome in the world right now. And what I didn't realize was until at night when the whole thing becomes a video wall. So if you're inside of it, imagine being in a stadium, the whole thing is a video wall. So it's completely staggering. How are we doing on time? I don't want to take your...
You've got 12 more minutes to be fit.
12 more minutes, okay. I'm going to jump into something else real quick. So anyway, that's the World Expo. I want to talk to you about that. But since we have a little bit more time, I want to share with you the thing about the French voting system, because I think it's very interesting to see what that's like compared to what we do here in the United States. So as I mentioned, if you want to pass these around. So we're very familiar in the United States with the system, right? You pretty much, at the end of the day, have two sets of... So take a look at these. You have you essentially have Republicans and Democrats, right? You pretty much have two choices. In France, that's not the way it works, right? The way it works is the government sends a common set of exactly the same profiles for each candidate. So unlike what we see with all the ads and everybody getting at each other and all this other stuff and all the campaigning, what you actually get in France is every French citizen gets a letter that contains 12 of these for each one of the 12 people running in the first round. And the idea is that they're all printed the same way, by the same person. They're all mixed so that there's no one on top versus another one every single time. And you get to evaluate those 12 candidates based on what they tell you. And then from there, you vote for the first round. And then you get to select, out of the first round, typically it's the top two that then do a runoff for the second round. So we've already got the first round two candidates, which are one of the two of the 12s that you see here. But the reason why I want to show this to you is because, again, we're so used to the way things are done here, right, that we don't necessarily think of a different way of doing it.
So are you saying they don't live through all those awful commercials?
Correct. Correct.
How many
It's
months?
way more regulated, and more importantly, instead of all the paperwork that you get, this is what you get. You actually get their stance on whatever issues they have and whatever their platform is. But it's not a huge booklet or a small one. It's consistently the same size and amount for each one of them. So what's interesting about it when you look at it is the variation of what they're saying they're about is way broader than what you typically see here. So you might see people who are Trotskyists and anarchists or ecologists or people who are all about space travel. Like literally, that's their campaign platform. So you have a much bigger variety. So just to pick one example, I'll show you this one, I think, right here. So this one, for example, right here is a guy, so his, so l'urgence anti-capitaliste, the urgency of anti-capitalism. Our lives are worth more than their profits. And so he was a fired worker, and he's an anti-capitalist candidate. So his whole campaign is anti-capitalism. That's his campaign. This guy here, I believe, is, this one is all about ecology. So his whole campaign platform is all about the environment and ecology. And so my point is, because of that, you get a tremendous breadth of ideas, and it really changes the dynamics. And of course, once you get past round one, which in this case is super interesting for France, because you've got Macron, who's the incumbent, who's the youngest president of France, at I think age 35. And then you've got Marine Le Pen, who's very right-wing. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. But keep in mind, there were 3 candidates that were above 20%. So between the 3 candidates, they had over 75% of the votes. But then the others have, small 7%, 2%, or whatever. So you really get to see what everybody thinks about all the candidates. And then those ones that didn't make the first round collaborate with one another, depending on who they think should be the right person. So there's some fun ones in the back. If you want to put out the one you have, just open it up for us if you could. Yeah. So this guy, for example, to me looks like an album poster, right?
Yeah.
And it's the France of happier days. So it literally feels like you're looking at a song, Yeah. Yeah. So there's a huge diversity. Yeah. Yeah. So that's one thing I want to share with you, simply because we always think that the way things are the way they have to be. And the reality is, the more exposure you get to the rest of the world, the more you realize that that's not the way it has to be. That's not necessarily the way it should be. And sometimes there are better or other ideas of how to handle these things. So I think, again, international exposure is super important, because that's how you really get context, for this type of stuff. Yeah.
So I'm just curious, if you don't mind, how much international exposure have you had? Raise your hand if you've been to one other country outside of the United States. Raise your hand.
Mm-hmm.
Raise your hand. Keep your hand up if you've lived in one other country outside of the United States.
A few of you. That's great. So it's already kind of unusual. That's a high percentage. Yeah. Yeah. So one comment I would have for all of you. I mean, obviously you've all had international exposure, which is great. And it's one thing to go to, say, Mexico or travel to Paris or Italy or whatever. But one of the things that changes as you get towards where you are in life is that soon, if not already now, you'll have the opportunity to potentially study abroad and travel abroad. And I'm going to tell you something. I've lived in a number of countries. I've worked in many countries. I have 3 citizenships, so I've got the ability to do a lot of travel. It's easy for me to do that. I can go to countries that others can't go, because I can choose which passport I use. The point is, I think that exposure is really critical, and you're at a stage in life where you'll have the most ability to do it. Because as you get older, you're going to you might get married, you might have kids, you might have a mortgage, you might have a car, you might have a job, and all those things become part of your life, and it becomes much harder to go out and go somewhere else. When you're at your stage in life, even as early as freshman, sophomore year in high school, there are programs that exist that allow you to spend a whole summer abroad, and you can live abroad and sometimes work abroad. And I would tell you, I know it's a big leap sometimes if you haven't done as much of that, but it's an amazing opportunity, and it'll never be as easy as it is at this stage in your life until much later. Now my kids are getting a little older, I can travel more, but there's a window that you have from now through college and a little bit past college where you'll be able to do this much more easily. And I would encourage you to just take advantage of that, because many people who I've talked to who've done this have said that that's the thing that's shaped their life the most, meaning that these kinds of trips where they all of a sudden didn't just go there for a vacation with family and spend 2 weeks. I'm talking about spending a month, 2 months, 3 months or more, or sometimes a semester or 2. And they come out of that saying, it's opened my mind to the differences that exist in the world, and then you bring that back with you. Sometimes it's not as easy. Like when I came here, I didn't speak a word of English, and I was dropped right into a school, and I had to pick it up as I was there. That's tough, because you end up not feeling home anywhere. You know, you go back home and all of a sudden you're different than the other kids because you no longer have the same educational track. You're exposed to different culture. So you end up kind of being kind of lost in both cultures. But then in time you realize there's another culture altogether, which is, you know, more of a global citizen, where you start really seeing things with a very different perspective than just a single country. Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, are there other questions? Because I'm intrigued. Okay, so I hear you saying visit the world, but if they had to choose where to start, Dubai.
So Dubai is incredible.
Yeah.
Dubai is a thing where, I mean, one of the things that was kind of shocking for me is we're driving out to Abu Dhabi, and Abu Dhabi, there's a bunch of Emirates like Oman, Dubai, and they're all small populations-ish. They're growing fast, you know, compared to, say, the United States, right? But what's interesting is, as I was driving out, you could see the next level the next city they were building, which is all part of the greater Dubai. So they're building at an accelerated pace. So the country that you see, that literally you could go back 2 years later, and it's going to be vastly different, you know. And that's, I think, a place right now where imagination, size, and what can be done is incredible. It's also culturally very different, you know. There's a lot of little details, like, for example, there's absolutely no PDA anywhere, right? Because again, it's a Muslim culture, and you know, you've got to, and there's, you know, they're very strict about certain things, very tolerant of foreigners, but also very much mindful of their culture and religion. The other part of it that's fascinating is we were driving out, and there's a mountain, and I'm like, what is that? Because, you know, it's a desert. There's, you know, it's flat, you know. And they're like, oh, that's a mountain. I'm like, well, what's it about? And they're like, well, that was built to try to see if we could change the weather in Dubai because it was too hot. So they literally just said, we'll just try it. We're going to see if we can build this thing that maybe will change and make it cooler in the city of Dubai. Because it gets so hot in the summer, like 60 degrees Celsius, like 130, 140 Fahrenheit, that in theory you can't even be outside. So it's literally a place where, you know, there's no limit to what will be done in that country. I mean, it's literally a place that is going to challenge every expectation you have. And one of my friends said it the best way. He said he woke up one morning and he didn't know when he was going to open the window if there was going to be a hovercraft that was going to take him to his next appointment. It literally feels like you're living in the future, you know. So I think it's, you know, again, it's worth going. It's a big trip. It's worth going. But the other thing I'll tell you is I did a trip to Pakistan, and you know, Pakistan in the news doesn't get the best reputation, is not painted well in the United States, but the reality is it was incredible. People were super welcoming. It was not at all what I'd seen in the news and what I thought it would be. So I think sometimes you got to realize that we're very sheltered here. You know, we're in a country, we're far away from other countries. We have really Mexico and Canada as borders. Most other countries have a lot more countries that they're close to, and they get a lot more variety of news. So even here, if you listen to CBC versus the US news, you're going to get a very different perspective of what's happening in the world. So to me, I would also say it's okay to go to a country that's not at all like a bucket list place, because you might discover things that others haven't, and it's sometimes hidden gems. Go ahead. So yes and no. There's programs that exist that are at your age level. There's programs that do exist out there that allow you to go and spend months or semesters abroad. Sometimes there are things that are where you can work abroad. So for example, in college, one of the things I looked into was something called the JET program, which is a Japanese program where you teach English, and they pretty much pay for your housing. What's that?
We both almost did that one.
Yeah. So there's things like that where you are actually getting paid to go and do this. Now you have a job, but it's in a foreign country. So I think there's a lot of opportunities that exist with varying levels. What I can tell you.
If you're interested in doing something like that, I can connect you with a couple of the bigger programs that do that. And
Yeah.
some of them, especially as he's mentioning Japan, some countries will have their government putting money behind it. So Japan is one of those countries that gives a lot of scholarships to bring people over, because he's been talking about this concept of civil like diplomacy, right?
Yep.
And so that's one of the things that some countries will do, is they'll put scholarships into it so that you'll come and look at their country and have a more favorable relationship and some meaningful relationships that last. So if
Yeah.
you're ever interested in something like that, come to me, come by
Yeah.
and see me.
And keep an eye out for it, because the reality at various stages there'll be opportunities to study abroad, and there's ultimately a lot of opportunities. And even I'll tell you with Dubai, it was a lot less expensive than I expected. I expected it to be very expensive, and in reality you can spend a lot of money there. There's no question, but you can also live in accommodations that are nicer than what you'd find here for a third the price. So it's also highly variable. But just to give you another example, a lot of schools in Canada also have programs where if you're studying French, and you'll have to look into the specifics, and they still do this, but sometimes they pay for your university. So there's literally things out there that are pretty incredible if you just have to research it, you know. Yeah. Questions?
We're down to our last 2 minutes. So, burning questions?
I have one.
Go ahead.
Did you get to go to the Iranian spice market, the old souk?
So we went to the old souk. Yes, we did. Yes.
That's a contrast.
Sure, totally. Well, there's one that's very touristy in the beginning that we went to. That's kind of, you know, because everything is new, and then there's one that's actually in the old Dubai that used to be by the river. Yeah, correct. Yeah. So what's interesting about the spices was one of the big things. There were really pearls, goats, dates, and spices that would come through this creek I was just telling you about. That's 1 foot deep. And the spices, what's interesting is they have all these kinds of saps. So if you're familiar with myrrh and frankincense and all that stuff, they have a lot of that stuff. And what they do is they use it as a perfume in a way. So you literally have a burner and you burn it. And if you're familiar, you can imagine the traditional kind of clothing. Men would just go under it like this, and you basically would get all the smells of these things, and that would give you kind of a scent as you'd walk for the rest of your day. So they do that for about 20 minutes, and that's a technique. And
They use sandalwood as well.
Yes, sandalwood and a whole bunch of other things like that, yeah. And so these smells are, I mean, you smell them everywhere you go, really, in Dubai. And there's a lot of spices and things of that nature. Yeah. Great, well, thank you for your time.
Well, you said, thank you so much for an intriguing talk.
Yeah.
We appreciate it.
For sure, thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.